Thank you everyone for joining us today for our Android workshop. As you know, this is an event that we're running exclusive to Juni students and families as part of an event series to help serve our community to keep parents and students engaged with interesting topics while we're at home during quarantine. So my name is Ruby Lee, and I am the co-founder and Chief Technology Officer at Juni Learning. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Rahul Pandey, my good friend, who I will fully introduce in a moment. And so with that, thank you guys again so much for joining us. We have a huge group today, which is super exciting. And I have the pleasure of introducing our guest. So Rahul is an Android engineer at Facebook working on Portal. He's also a lecturer at Stanford University, where he teaches Android development in the computer science department. Rahul regularly publishes tutorials on YouTube where he builds various projects and shares what he's learned about Android. And prior to joining Facebook, Rahul was a founding engineer at a venture-backed startup, and then he worked at Pinterest. So with that, welcome Rahul, and we will let you take it away.
Thanks, Ruby. Yes, I've known Ruby, I don't know, it's been about 10 years if I'm counting correctly. And, I look back at when I was in middle school and high school, and if I had a program like Juni Learning back then, led by someone as hardworking and helpful as Ruby, I would have been the first one to sign up. So I'm really jealous of all of you, to be able to participate in something like Juni. And I'm really happy to be able to spend, about an hour and a half with you today. So, like Ruby mentioned, I am an Android engineer at Facebook. I work on a product called Portal, which I can talk more about at the end if we have time. And at the same time, I also teach. I'm a lecturer at Stanford where I talk about Android development. And I also do a lot of kind of seminars like this. And so I love doing Android development. I love teaching. And so this is kind of a combination of two things I really love. And I'm really excited to be here and kind of help as much as I can. So the way I want to structure this is about 45 minutes or maybe 40 minutes of doing an Android project with you. I think, like Ruby mentioned, I imagine for most of you, this is going to be your very first experience in the world of Android. So I'm really excited to show you that. And then with whatever time we have left over, I'm happy to take any questions you have about Android or about my background of how I got to where I am today. Cool? All right, so before we dive into the slides, I have maybe 5 or 6 slides I want to talk you through. I'd love to get a sense from the room about where are people coming from. In particular, I want to know, what phone do you use today? So most people in the world, right, either will use an iPhone or an Android. And so I want you to use the raise hand feature to tell me if you are using an Android device, an Android phone, as your primary phone. I'm looking at the participants chat now and trying to just gauge how many people are raising their hand. So I'll give it maybe 20 more seconds.
And if you're not sure how to raise your hand in Zoom, you just click participants at the bottom, and then you'll see a button that shows you where you can raise your hand. Yeah.
All right, I'm starting to see all these hands being raised, so thank you for that. So yeah, it looks like, I don't know, maybe a third of people are using an Android device as their primary phone, which is kind of what I expected. So, if you look at the distribution across the world, there are a couple countries, for example, the US and Japan, where the iPhone is dominant. And when I say iPhone dominant, I mean to say that the majority of the people in that country are using an iPhone. And so that's kind of what is represented here, right? Most people, I would say, are using an iPhone, which is totally fine. But the really cool thing about Android is that if you look worldwide, across all the countries, you'll find that Android is way, way more popular. And so as a developer, as an engineer, one of the things I look at is, how can I have the most impact on the world? How can I touch the most people in the world? And if you compare iPhone development to Android development, it's no doubt you're going to be able to reach more people with Android. So if you think about countries like India or Brazil or things like that, the number of people who have Android is way larger than the people who have iPhone. So it's interesting, that as expected, a lot of people here have an iPhone as their primary device. We do have a good number of Android, but worldwide, one of the really cool things about Android is that you can reach so many more people, more than 2 billion people. So thank you for indulging me. I'm going to share my screen now and just walk through a little bit of materials that I had prepared. All right, are you all able to see my screen? Ruby, can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so welcome to the world of Android. It's a huge, crazy, fast-changing world, and I'm really excited to kind of be the person to introduce you to it. Some quick background. I think a lot of you might be familiar with this already, but what is Android? Android is a mobile operating system maintained by Google. The other dominant mobile platform is called iOS or iPhone, and that's maintained by Apple. And if you think about the largest companies in the world, it's no coincidence that Google and Apple are two of the largest companies in the world. If you're able to control the maintenance and changes of a huge platform like Android or iOS, that's a tremendous amount of value, right? There's so many people who spend hours and hours per day in their iPhone or Android, right? So if you're able to control that operating system, the Android operating system or the iPhone operating system, you're a hugely valuable company. And that's part of the reason why Google is so valuable. One of the other things that is really attractive about Android for me, and I think for a lot of other people, is that it's open source. And what open source means is that the code for Android, the code that powers your phone, is freely accessible. So if you really wanted to, you could actually go into the Android source code, clone it, which means make a copy of it, modify it, and make your own phone, which is Android-based. And that's something you couldn't really do in the world of iPhone or the iOS operating system. And so this ethos of being able to have control over your code and being able to modify it is something that is really attractive to engineers or hackers. And that's something that drew me to Android. And the other thing that I touched on a few minutes ago is that Android is the most popular operating system in the world. If you look at the number of devices which have Android installed, it's way bigger than iPhone, Windows, Mac OS, anything like that, Linux. And so if you talk about the potential to reach millions or even billions of people, that really is only possible in Android. So those are kind of two of the primary reasons that I picked Android when I thought about what should I be doing with my career or my life. All right, so I want to spend maybe half an hour, 35 minutes building an app with you. And the app I want to build with you is called the Magic 8-Ball app. So I don't know, I mean, I feel like I'm a bit removed from high school and middle school. I don't know what are the popular toys these days. But when I was younger, my siblings and I would play with this toy called the Magic 8-Ball. I don't know, people familiar with the Magic 8-Ball? So the idea of the Magic 8-Ball, if you're not familiar with it, is that it's this spherical ball. It looks like a billiard ball or a pool ball. You shake it, and you ask it a yes or no question. So for example, I might ask it, will I have pizza tonight? Instead of, whatever my mom is making. And so I would shake the 8-Ball and say, hey, will I have pizza tonight? And then I would turn over the 8-Ball, and it would show me, as I see it, yes. And I would get really happy. Okay, now I'm going to be able to order pizza and get my favorite toppings and, feast on this pizza tonight. And so the idea of the 8-Ball is that you ask a yes or no question, you turn over the 8-Ball, and it will reveal to you the answer. It'll tell you the future. So we're going to build this as an Android app. We're going to have an image. If you click on that image, that's going to be representing that you shake the 8-Ball and you turn it around. And then our app is going to tell you the answer to your yes or no question. Cool. So I'm going to jump now into Android Studio. And I think a lot of you, some of you might have set up Android Studio. Some of you may not have, and that's totally fine if you haven't. If you have set it up, I'm going to go at a pace such that you can actually follow along and build it with me. And that would be really exciting. And if you haven't had it set up, then just feel free to watch us as we build it. And if you have any questions, I'll lean on Ruby. You can put it in the chat, and I'll lean on Ruby to interrupt me whenever, and I can answer any questions you have. Okay, so what I have here is Android Studio. And one thing I'll just mention is that I find that I've been teaching Android for a while now. What I have found is that oftentimes for students, the hardest part about Android is actually the setup. Once you have Android Studio set up and the emulator set up, it's actually smooth sailing. And I'm very confident all of you would be able to kind of code it with me. But the hardest part is setup. So once you get through that initial hump of being able to set up Android, I guarantee all of you will have a really easy and fun time building out apps. So I'm not going to go through the setup here, but that's just something to keep in mind as you go deeper in Android. All right, so what I have here is Android Studio version 4.0. I'm going to start a new Android Studio project, pick the empty activity template. And then what we're going to do is name our application Magic 8 Ball. And then you can leave all these other options as a default. And if you have questions, we can talk more about them. But the defaults are typically fine. Just tap on finish. And now what's happening is Android Studio is going to set up the scaffolding for your brand new empty project. And I'll talk through kind of the files that Android Studio has generated for us in a minute. But before that, let me just try running the application. Actually, before I run the application, let me show you what exactly we're going to build. So do you see this? What I have in the center of my screen now is called the emulator. So the idea is that this is an emulator, which is emulating your Android phone, right? So this is actually very much like an Android phone. I can go to the home screen. I can look up all my apps that I have here. I can pull down and I can see all the settings. So you can really kind of think of it like an Android phone. And this is a really good way to test your application as you develop it. So the app that we're going to build is this one. And I'm going to ask yes or no question, like, will we have pizza tonight, right? I tap on the 8 ball and it says, oh, ask my parents. And almost certainly the answer is going to be no if I ask my parents. So let me try rolling the 8 ball again. Very doubtful. Okay, so it looks like it's not going to happen for me tonight, but hopefully for some of you, if you roll the 8 ball, you'll get to have pizza. But this is actually what we're going to build. What I have here is a totally empty project. And the first thing I like to do whenever I have a new project is run the app. Okay, so let me show you how to do that. There's a lot of, one of the things about Android Studio is that there's so much going on. If you look at the screen, there's so much text, so many buttons, it's kind of overwhelming. So let me help demystify that a little bit. The only thing you should really worry about right now is this green triangle icon. So if I hover over it, you know how it says right there, run app. So without doing any changes, all I did is I created an empty project. I'm going to hit this run app button. And before you can hit the run app button, you'll need to have here an emulator which is already running. And so I have this Pixel 2 emulator, right? And that's what I just showed you over here with the completed app. But I'm going to hit run app on this empty project. And what this is doing, you can see down here at the bottom of the screen, it says Gradle build running. It's going to take a minute or two, and then it's going to build an application and then push that application onto the device. And so here you can see our brand new empty project. And by default, it says hello world. So if you've gotten this far, honestly, you've done the hardest part, just being able to run the application. Everything else, you're going to be able to do just fine. Cool? Okay. So let me now spend a minute or two talking about what are the main parts of our application, our empty project application. So by default, when you create a new empty project, you're going to see a UI, like Android Studio will present something like this to you. And the main file that you're looking at here is called main activity. So in Android terminology, an activity is a screen. Okay, so when we're looking at main activity here, basically think of this as the main screen of our application. And in fact, there is only one screen in our application, but this is the only screen, the main activity. Don't worry about too much of the other code. The only other line I want you to pay attention to in this file is line number 10, which says set content view r.layout.activity main. So I described how the main activity is the logic or the code for your main screen. The UI for this main screen is dictated by line number 10, set content view. So we're saying set content view of this variable, r.layout.activity main, and this is defining for us what should the user see when we load up the main activity, the main screen. And this main activity main is defined up here in this other tab. So now let me show that to you. So here's back in Android Studio. I now tap on activity main. And you can see this is exactly the UI that we were seeing when we ran the app, right? This is what you're seeing over here. And the activity main XML, so the file ends in XML. What this means that this file is written in something called XML language. And let me show that to you. So up here on the top right of Android Studio, you have a couple of different options of how do you want to view this file.
Rahul,
right now
I'll pause you for 1 second there. I think folks have some questions about whether you're programming in Java or Python, and if they only know Python, how that relates here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to hold off on that for about 30 seconds, and I'm going to answer that directly. But let me just finish up talking about the XML. But that's a great question, and that's a very deep question, actually, and I'll talk about that. But right now, here's activity main.xml. And I'll talk about XML as well. I imagine for many of the students here, you may not have worked with XML, and that's totally fine. I'll walk you through it. But basically, XML is defining the UI, the user interface for our application. And if you want to see the raw underlying XML, you can go into the code tab. And here you can actually see this is what XML looks like. So we have something called a constraint layout, and instead of it, a text view. And this text view says, hello world. That is where the hello world text is coming from, right here. So those are the main pieces of our application. Let me break that down. So there are two parts to an Android app. One, which is a UI definition. That's the XML that we just looked at, right? This is going to define the hello world text that we see. Or when we complete our application, it's going to define that button for the magic 8-ball, and it'll have a text at the top saying, ask yes or no question, and so on. The other part is a programming language. And this is kind of Ruby, what I heard you just ask about, right? The programming language we're going to use is a language called Kotlin. And I also don't expect any of you to have worked with Kotlin before. Kotlin is a brand new language. It literally, I think it's less than maybe 7 or 8 years old. So it's a very new language compared to something like Python or Java. Those languages are decades old. So Kotlin is a very new language. It's very fun to work with, but it does take some getting used to. And I'll walk you through that. But this is actually a really interesting question that you asked a question about what language are we going to use. Let me ask a question too. What is a programming language? So, I mean, I think I talked to Ruby, and a lot of you, I think, have worked with a language like Python or Java, right? So I'm telling you that, for our application, we're going to be using another language called Kotlin. So can anyone help me out and tell me in general, don't worry about Kotlin, but in general, what is the purpose of a programming language, and what is a language? What is a programming language? I love that. Ruddy, that's an amazing answer. I think, let me just rephrase that. A programming language is a set of instructions to tell the computer what you want it to do. That's exactly right. And so when you think about something like Java or Python, you now know one way using Java or Python to tell the computer what you want it to do. So Kotlin is exactly the same. The syntax, like how you write Kotlin code, is going to be different. It's going to look a little bit weird to you if you're not familiar with the language, but the concept is the same. Kotlin is a programming language, and it'll tell the Android computer, the Android operating system, what you want it to do. So those are the main two parts of an Android application. One is XML, which I want to talk more about because I don't think, in general, we don't have as much awareness of XML. But programming language, I think you're already aware of what is a language, right? You already know Java, Python, JavaScript, and Kotlin is just one more language. So XML, right? This is something that I imagine is going to be new for many of you. XML is a language to describe hierarchical data, right? And the way this works is that you're going to have an element, which is this angle bracket followed by the name of the element. And then inside of that element, you're going to have different attributes, okay? And each attribute has a key and a value. So what you're seeing here is you have attribute 1, and it has the value of this value, attribute 2, and so on. And then you can either have an element and it can have other elements inside of it. So that's what it means when I say hierarchical. That means you could have one element, and inside of that element, you could have other embedded elements. Or you could have the element be self-closing, which means that there are no children of this element. And one important thing to note, where some students will get tripped up, is that XML is case sensitive. What that means is that capital letters are different from lowercase letters. Right? And so if you have, like capital E here, that'll have a different meaning compared to a lowercase e. So you just want to be careful about that. So let me relate this back to what we just saw. If I go back to Android Studio, here is the XML that we have from our empty project. So what you can see here is you have an element, which is called a constraint layout. This is what the element is. And you have a bunch of different attributes. Okay, and don't worry too much about what these attributes are, but it's basically, here's one attribute, and the value of that attribute is this. And so on, for you have maybe like 1, 2, 3, you have 6 different attributes on here. And then inside of this element, you have one more element. And this element is called a text view. And you can think of a text view like a label. So this text view element has an attribute called text, Android text. And the value of this attribute is named hello world. And that's exactly how we're able to see the hello world text show up right here. Make sense? So that's kind of the basics of XML. We'd have an understanding now of what is XML. And the idea of the XML in Android Studio or Android is to define the UI. And so I don't want to actually spend too much time on writing all the code out. So I'm going to give it to you. So I'm going to put this link in the chat, and all you can click on this link and then copy and paste it and put it into your activity main.xml. So I'm going to do that. And then while I do that, I have another question for all of you. All right, are all of you, I just put a link in the chat. And then what you can do is you can click on that link, or maybe Command-C, Command-V on a Mac, or Control copy paste it on a PC. And then I want you to just load that up, and I'll tell you what to do with it. But while each of you are doing that, if you're actually building this with me, feel free to do that. If you're not building with me, I have a question for you. So we have this thing called XML, and we also have another concept called a programming language, right? XML is used to define what the data for presenting our user interface, our layout. So my question is, what's the difference between XML and a programming language like Kotlin? So I'm telling you, it would not be correct to call XML a programming language. Can anyone tell me what the difference is? So what can you do in a programming language that you would not be able to do in XML? Does anyone have thoughts on that? So basically what I'm hearing you say is that the way you use XML is different from how you use Kotlin or Python or Java, because what they allow you to do is different. I think that's kind of what I'm hearing, and that's a good answer. That's a really good answer. Basically, the application of XML is different. And there is one kind of more nuanced aspect that I want to hit on. And I think this is maybe what you're getting at, Rihan. But basically what I want to comment about is that the main difference in my mind, that there's no logic in XML. What I mean by that is, for those of you who have done Python or Java, you have, for example, an if statement. You can say, if a condition is true, do something. If it's not true, do something else. Or maybe you have heard about a for loop, right? So a for loop is something where you can iterate, or you can traverse a list. You can kind of print out for each element in a list, you can do something, right? Those are concepts of logic. Like, you could embed logic in a programming language. That concept of logic doesn't exist in XML. That, in my mind, is the main difference. So XML is designed to send data back and forth. Programming languages are designed to embed logic in what you want to do. So you can react to changes in your program. Does that kind of make sense at a high level? The idea of XML is it's more dumb. It's stupid. All it's doing is it's declaring what you want to show up on the screen. Whereas programming languages are smarter. They have the ability to react to, okay, if this statement is true, then do this. Or maybe you can iterate over a list of elements and do some operation on them. That's kind of one of the main concepts I want you to take away, is that XML is basically for data presentation and just putting stuff on the screen, and programming languages are used to actually be the brain of your application. All right, awesome. So hopefully at this point, you have opened up this link, right? I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to copy this. And now I'm going to replace the whole contents of activity main.xml. And I'm going to paste in what I just copied. Okay, so let me, the reason I don't want to kind of code this with you is I don't think it's that interesting. And I'm sure all of you could do this on your own, but I wanted to just copy paste it just so we can save some time. But I'll walk you through it. So what we have here is a linear layout. So this element is called a linear layout. And again, we have a couple of different attributes here. And then inside of this element, there are a couple children elements. In particular, we have a text view here. We have an edit text, an image button, and a text view. Okay, so a text view in the world of Android is basically a label. It just shows you some text. And then below that, so basically a linear layout is an element which allows you to have different children inside of it. And there's a special attribute here called orientation, which means all the children inside of linear layout, I want it to be vertically oriented. I want them to be stacked one on top of another. The topmost element is called a text view, and this has a label which says, ask a yes or no question. Below that, we have an edit text, and then an edit text allows you to enter in text. And we have a hint here. It says, will it rain tomorrow? Then we have an image button, which we're going to put in some placeholder image. And then at the very bottom, we have a text view, which is another label, and it has a hint, which is ... So if you think back to kind of the app that we had from before, the completed application, let me show you that. Does it kind of make sense how we're already building toward this, right? So we have a linear layout. At the very top, we have a text view. That's what this thing is. Then below that, we have edit text. That's what this element is, starting on line 18. Below that, we have an image button, which is this thing. And at the very bottom, we have a text view, which is this bottom element. So if you can put that together and you can map what I'm seeing in the code here to what you're seeing on my emulator, you pretty much know XML already. Cool? So now let me show you, after I copied and pasted this, I'm going to run the application right now. So this is going to take a minute or two. At the bottom of my screen, you can see that it says Gradle build is running, and then it says something about installing. And now here's our application. Instead of showing hello world, we're now you can now see this brand new layout that we created. At the top is the text view. Then we have edit text. I can enter in whatever text I want. And then we have an image button here. So the idea of an image button is it's a button, which is also an image. So I can tap on it, right? And then below that, we have another text view, which just says ... for now. Cool. So now the only thing I have to do is I want to add the logic, the brains of our application in main activity.kotlin back over here. I want to add in logic so that when I tap on a button here, the text view here should be updated. And it should tell me the answer to my question.
And real quick, Rahul, Rihan asks in the chat, how do you register images in the Android Studio application? Is that something you'll go over in a moment?
Yeah, so so basically, if you copy and paste the text that I provided, there's nothing to do. It should just automatically work. And the reason it automatically works is that this image that you're seeing right now, this Android icon, is built into every single project. This is called the IC launcher round. This is the launcher icon. So I think, Rihan, what your question is, which is a really good one, is how can I change the image? How can I make it my own image? And the way you would do that, I can actually, let's do that right now. I think it's a good, why don't we just take a minute or two to do that? So what you want to do is, I opened up the project by tapping on this project tool window. And then there's a folder in source, main, and then res. So res stands for resources. So if you wanted to change an image and have your own image, you would have to download an image from the internet and then drag and drop that into the drawable folder. So I can show you how that works. So I have here Finder, and I already downloaded from the internet this magic8ball.png. I just went to Wikipedia and I downloaded the image. So now I'm going to drag this and put it into drawable. And then you can see that Android Studio is saying, hey, do you want to move this file? And I'm going to tap OK. Cool. And now do you see how it showed Magic 8-Ball over here? So now, instead of saying the source is mipmap, whatever, I'm going to say the source is going to be the drawable Magic 8. And now let's run the application again. And let's see if that worked. So now, hopefully, if we've done the job correctly, we should no longer see that, and we should see a Magic 8-Ball. There, you can see it. So in general, that's kind of the process of how you would customize this with your own image.
And just in case you guys aren't able to get that working right now, that's totally fine. Again, just focus on following Rahul and watching the demo, and you can email questions to him afterward, and we're recording this, so you'll be able to get the recording afterward as well.
Yeah.
And one other question that somebody had earlier was, does the emulator always come installed with Android Studio? Is that something you have to install separately? And if it's not, then if you could go over one more time how to start the emulator.
Yeah, so the emulator doesn't come by default with Android Studio. That's something you have to do on your own. When you do Android development, there are two options. Either you can do the development of your app on an emulator, like what we're doing here, or the other option, if you actually have an Android phone, like I do, I have an Android phone, you can plug your Android phone into your computer, and you can actually use your physical Android device. So you can do whatever you're more comfortable with. If you don't have an Android phone, of course, you should just be using an emulator. And the reason an emulator actually is better is because you can see here, I have a bunch of I have 4 different emulators on my computer. And so the cool thing about this is that you could test out your application on the most recent Android phone, which came out this year, and you can go back 10 years ago and test out your application on an emulator from 10 years ago, which is emulating a device from 2010, for example. And so it doesn't come by default. What you would have to do is you would tap on this dropdown and go to AVD Manager. AVD Manager stands for Android Virtual Device Manager. Basically, it's a way to manage all of your different emulators. And what you would do here, let me shrink this a little bit. You would tap on this button for Create Virtual Device. And that might take actually like 10 minutes because you'll notice here the size on disk. These emulators are like multiple gigabytes big. So it's going to take you a long time to actually download it, which is why if you don't have it set up right now, don't worry about it. Do it later because it's going to take you a while. But this is the process of how you would set up a new emulator.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So cool. We'll let you keep going. And just as a reminder to everyone, if you're not able to see exactly what Rahul has on his screen, don't panic. You can just follow along with what he's doing and demonstrating, and then we'll answer questions at the end.
Yeah. And again, I think that's a really good call out, Ruby. I just want to point out one more time. The hardest part about Android is setup. If you're not seeing exactly what I'm seeing here with this dropdown, don't worry about it. I'm happy to help as much as I can after we're done with our scheduled time. Okay, cool. So the only thing left to do is we've built out the UI in our XML, right? We copy and pasted this XML. The only thing left is we have to go into mainActivity.kotlin, and we're now going to build out the brain of our application. So what do we want to do in the brain, in the mainActivity.kotlin file? I think there's a couple things, right? The first thing is we want to get notified when I've clicked on the button. When the user has clicked on the button. Right, and then when the user has clicked on the button, let's go back to our completed application. Go back here. So when the user has clicked on the button, the thing I want to do is I want to replace the text of this bottom text view with something new, right? So that's the second thing. Bottom text view with a new random answer, right? So the way the Magic 8 Ball works, this is a spoiler alert, but the Magic 8 Ball doesn't actually tell you the future. It randomly picks one option out of like 10 options. I can see a lot of you are surprised. I'm sorry I ruined the magic of the Magic 8 Ball. But yeah, basically, we're going to generate a random answer out of a list of like 10 answers. And we're going to randomly replace the text at the bottom with this new random answer. Cool? If you can understand this. So what I've done here, these comments, these 2 slashes represent comments. What I do when I program is I always, before I write any code, I think about what do I want to do? And I write comments describing what I want to do. This is called pseudocode. I don't know. Are people familiar with this idea of pseudocode? So if you can translate the program in your head, the application, and translate that into pseudocode, you've already done most of the work. Now our job is to translate the pseudocode into actual code. Okay? So before we actually get into that, there's one thing I want to do, which is I want to generate right now a list of different random answers. Okay, so I'm going to define here private answers, private val answers. Okay, so this is how you declare a variable in Kotlin. So I'm calling it private val. Val is basically a keyword which describes this is a variable, and we called it answers. And I'm declaring it as a list of different strings. Okay, so what I can do here is I can just put in whatever list of strings that I want. Okay, so here is where I'm going to put in all the different options I have. So I'm going to fill in a few right now. I'll say definitely, right? So these are all answers to yes or no questions. So the first one is going to say definitely. Will I have pizza tonight? Definitely. And then another one might be no way. And then a third one might be ask my mom. And then a fourth one might be, hey, someone throw it out there. Give me a response to the Magic 8 Ball. Anyone?
The first one in the chat is perhaps.
Perhaps. I like that. Are there any others in the chat, Ruby?
There are a lot of other ones in the chat. I will give you one more. How about ask again?
I like that. Okay. And I'm going to maybe add in maybe 2 more. So I'll say like, let me space this out a little bit.
We have plausible.
I like it.
And hazy is another popular one.
I like it, yeah.
Okay, you guys can stop sending options.
That's good.
Thank you.
All right, just one more for good measure, almost certainly. Okay, so we have a good list now of potential answers that the 8-ball can reply with, right? So now let's go back to the pseudocode. We want to get notified when the user has clicked on the button. The way this works in Android is we need to get a reference to the button, right? Basically, in the terminology of Android, what this line means is we want to have a click listener on the button. When the user clicks on the button, we want to get notified of that, right? We want to have a listener. So the way that works is I go back to the XML code, and here is the button, right? This is the button. And the key attribute you should pay attention to is this one. It's called the ID. The ID is a unique identifier for this button. So I'm going to copy the ID, go back into main activity, and I'm going to say button answer. And you'll notice here that it's trying to import something, right? So if you look at this blue text, it says use this keyboard shortcut. For me on a Mac, it's Option Enter. I'm going to tap Option Enter. And what that did is it added an import. Do you see that? And so now in our Kotlin file, we're able to reference the button. I'm going to say button answer dot set on click listener. So Android Studio, one of the really cool things about Android Studio is that it will autocomplete a lot of things for you. So I start typing set on click listener, and you can see that it shows me this option right here. So I double tap on that to let it autocomplete. And now you have these curly braces. So this is a really important concept in Android. The logic, the code that you write inside of these curly braces, these will automatically get executed every time I click on the button. That's how we're going to power our whole application. So every time I click on the button, this code here will run. The way I can prove this to you is there's something called logging in Android. Okay, so I'm going to define here. Actually, I'm just going to do it down here. So there's something called log.I. Okay, and I'm going to put in a tag, which is just put in like magic here. So I'll explain this later. I'll say clicked on the button. So the idea of logging is that this log is going to output something into the log output. Okay, so I'm opening up this tool window down here called Logcat, and you want to make sure that you have selected the correct app in this dropdown here. And now let me show you what will happen. So if I run the app, it's going to take a second or two to load up. Okay, so now our application loaded up. I'm going to tap on the button, and let's see, because I had this log statement here, I'm hoping that we should see some output down here. Do you see that? So I tap on it once, and it says clicked on the button. Do you see that? So I keep tapping on it, and I keep getting more and more output down here. So this is proof that every time I click on the button, the code inside of these curly braces is going to be run. Right? And so now the only thing left to do is we want to replace the text of the bottom text view with a new random answer. So just take a minute and think, how would you do this if I asked you this question? If you had to code this up, how would you code this up? So there are a couple of different kinds of errors that you could have, right? So let me first show you. Here's one thing that we can do to introduce an error. Here's like, I'm putting in some garbage text right here, right? Do you see that? I'm going to hit the button now. So now when I try running the app, it actually says down here, unresolved reference. So your app won't even build. You won't even be able to run your application. This is one example of an error. There's another kind of error, which I'm not sure which error you're kind of referring to exactly. There's another error where your app will actually run fine. It'll build correctly. But when you tap on the button, something will go wrong and your app will crash. Those are called runtime errors. And I can talk more about that later on if we have time. But basically, if that happens, you'll hit the button and your app will immediately get dismissed because there's been a runtime exception and the Android system, the OS, will kill your application. Those are the two kinds of errors. And actually, that's actually a really good question because as an Android developer, every single day I run into dozens of errors, okay? So if you do hit an error like this, like what we're seeing down here, you shouldn't get demoralized. This is a very natural part of building Android apps. And in fact, it's a very natural part of building any kind of project. Okay, so the only thing left now is we want to replace the text of the bottom text view with a new random answer. And the way we're going to do this is exactly the same as what we did for the button. I'm going to go back to the XML. And here, you remember the very bottom text view is this one. This one has an ID of TV answer. So I'm going to copy the ID. I'm going to go here. I'm going to reference that, TV answer. And there's a particular attribute on this text view. It's called text. So I'm going to say dot text. I'm going to set the text to be a random answer. For now, I'm just going to say text has changed. Like that, okay? So we're going to fill this in later with the proper code, but for now, just run this. So I run the app now. And if we've done our job correctly, what we expect to see now is when I tap on this 8 ball, this ... should be replaced with text has changed. Amazing. You see that? So the only thing we have to do now is we need to randomly get one of the options from this list of answers and replace that with replace text has changed with one of those random answers, right? Okay, so let's do that. It turns out this is actually really easy. All we need to do is this variable is called answers, right? I'm going to reference answers. I'm going to pick a random element out of that. So there's a method on the answers object, on the variable called random. Do you see that? It helped Android Studio help me autocomplete. The return value of this method call, random, is going to be one of these strings. Then I'm going to capture that into another variable. I'll say val random answer is equal to that. Does that make sense? So I have here, random answer is now going to be one of these options. It'll either be definitely, no way, and so on. So now instead of hard coding in text has changed, I'm going to set the text attribute to be random answer. Cool, let's run it. So like usual, Android Studio will take maybe 5 seconds or so to build our project. And now it built properly. And so now I can ask a question. I'll say, will I become a millionaire? What do you guys think?
Yes.
All right. I'm glad I have some faith. Some people have faith in me. Ask my mom. Dang it. I don't know if my mom is gonna believe in me. Well, let's try it one more time. What's happening? Let's see. Why is it not changing? Okay, well, so it seems like the randomness is not actually random. Like it's always showing me ask my mom. Let's try this one more time. If I run this one more time. So I'm going to ask another question. Will it rain tomorrow? Okay, so we do get a random answer here. So it says hazy. So not clear if it rains tomorrow. But now you can kind of see that this is the normal progression of how you build an app. You get the ID of the element that you want to modify, and you change it. So here's one more example, right? Last thing that I want to do with all of you before we can open up to Q&A. When I tap on this button, I want to remove the text in this edit text. So instead of right now it says, will it rain tomorrow? I tap on the button and it says hazy. At the same time, I want to remove the text which is shown here. So just take a moment, think about how would you do this? Given what we just did here, how would you implement that feature? And the answer is we do exactly the same thing that we already did. What we did before is we grabbed the ID of the relevant component on the screen. So in this case, the component on the screen that we want to modify is edit text to go back into activity main. And here is the edit text, right? And so the ID of this is called edit text. I'm going to copy that. And every time we click on the button, I'm going to look at the text attribute of the edit text, and I want to delete everything. So there's a method called clear. Cool, that's it. So let's try this. If I run the app now, again, it'll take a few seconds. What should the question be? How about, will I have tacos tonight? I don't know if people like tacos more or pizza more, but will I have tacos tonight?
Tacos.
Yeah, all right. I think we're on the same page. Tacos tonight. Amazing. It says no way, which is kind of sad. I'm not going to have tacos tonight. But you can see that it correctly emptied out that edit text, right? So we're not able to see anything here. So hopefully that gave you a sense. That's pretty much all I wanted to build with you today. But this idea of referencing the component on the screen by the ID and then modifying that component in the Kotlin file, in this main activity file, that is the core of how you do Android development. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Actually, sorry, premature. Let me share my screen one more time. I wanted to show my contact information. Ruby, is there a way? It seems like I lost the ability.
Yes, you can go ahead and try one more time.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually all I had. I hope this gave you a taste of Android. And like I mentioned, there's a lot that you could get tripped up on, especially in setup. Once you have the setup done, it really is smooth sailing. But if you have questions about setup or about Android, even beyond our time together today, I would love to help as much as I can. My email is right here. And like Ruby mentioned, whatever I learn as a programmer, as a software engineer, you're always learning, right? And so whatever I learn, I always try and make that public. I make that on YouTube. So if you're interested, feel free to check out any of the content I have on YouTube or Twitter. I'd love to connect with each of you even after today. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that any of you have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rahul. That was a really informative walkthrough, especially for folks who are being exposed to Android for the first time. So we're going to open it up to the Q&A portion now. And as I mentioned before, we're going to ask Rahul some questions that were repeatedly asked during registration, so we can cover those first. And then we will let the students ask some questions individually. I've also turned off the chat feature now since we're done with the workshop portion, and we can just ask questions to Rahul directly. So I'm going to start by asking Rahul to tell us a little bit about his story. So where did you grow up, Rahul? What were you interested in like elementary school, middle school, high school, when you were the age of all the Juni students in this meeting? And before you attended Stanford, maybe how did you get interested in computer science?
Yeah. So my journey to where I am today is I grew up in Michigan. I don't know if we have anyone from Michigan in the chat, but yeah, I grew up north of Detroit, and to be honest, I never really had much programming experience until I got to college. So in high school, the main thing I was interested in was number one, playing soccer and tennis. I was really into those, and number three, I really was into math. So like my brother was really competitive at doing math. I kind of followed in his footsteps, and I was really embedded in the math community. But I didn't really have any knowledge about how do you talk to computers? How do you build computer programs? But I think math is actually one of those things that, the skill of being able to take a math problem and analyze it and decompose it into what you need to do, that translates really well into programming. And so when I did go off and attend Stanford, I had the opportunity to work with Ruby. I met with a lot of other really, really smart people at Stanford. And that led me down this path of programming. Because I think one of the things at Silicon Valley, which is where Stanford is everyone is into tech, right? Everyone talks about the next big startup. I think that that environment, being around these really smart people who are all doing interesting things with computers, that led me to program. And so that's where I really got deep into programming. After Stanford, I was in a lab at Stanford, and I was doing a lot of research about recommendation systems and machine learning. And so I took that lab work, and my professor and we started a company together. And that's what I think, Ruby, you mentioned. It was a venture-backed company. That was a really good experience, a really eye-opening experience. And I did that for about a little bit less than a year. After that, I joined Pinterest. I don't know if people here use Pinterest, but I was there for about 3 years. And then from there on, at Pinterest, that's where I actually transitioned to Android. So here's the interesting story is that at the startup, I did machine learning, but it turns out I didn't like it at all. So like when I was at Stanford, machine learning was really hot. Even now, I mean, a lot of you might be familiar, but machine learning is this hot thing where everyone talks about the amazing power of machine learning. And I think that's true. There's a lot of potential in machine learning. But for me, what I found is that I didn't really enjoy it that much. And so when I went over to Pinterest, which was a much larger company, I had the opportunity to go into Android development. And for the reasons I talked about earlier in the presentation, being able to reach a bunch of people and this ethos of being able to be open and free and do whatever you want with Android, that led me to Android. After being at Pinterest for a while, I had the opportunity to join Facebook. And so it's been about 2.5 years now where I've been working, well, almost 3 years, where I've been working at Facebook as an Android engineer. So that's kind of the TLDR of how I got to where I am.
Awesome. So now you are a software engineer at Facebook full-time, in addition to building this amazing YouTube channel of Android content. So what is it like working at Facebook? You work on the Portal team. What is Portal? What does your day-to-day as a Facebook software engineer look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I work on a product called Portal. Portal is a video calling hardware device. So I don't know, a lot of you might be familiar with Alexa or Google Home. So you can kind of think of Portal as something very similar to Alexa, but it's designed for video calling. So it's really focused on how do you communicate with people. Facebook is all about connecting people. But yeah, so at Facebook, I work on this product, and it's interesting because Facebook is a huge, huge application, right? There's literally thousands of people who are committing code, who are writing code for Facebook. And so being an engineer, being a good engineer at Facebook, I think is very different from being a good engineer at a startup or like a 2-person company, which is what I was doing earlier. So my day-to-day, to answer your question, is I usually get into the office around 9 a.m. and I leave after dinner. So one of the cool things about Facebook is, you get free breakfast, free lunch, and free dinner. So I always go and, get all the free food. I come back maybe around 7:30, 8. And then usually that's where at work, I'm working on work stuff. I'm doing Facebook stuff. And when I come back from work, that's where I start spending a bit more time on doing more learning. There's a lot of Android in particular is changing constantly. Every single year, there's a new framework, a new technology that comes out in Android. And so I dedicate a lot of time every single day to learning about new technology.
So last question for you, Rahul, is so you've accomplished a lot and you have an amazing journey that I'm sure a lot of students are potentially interested in taking themselves. So for all the folks who are with us today, what tips do you have for students? What should they be doing outside of their regular Juni classes to grow as a programmer and just as a general learner? Like I'm hearing from you that you're still learning every day outside of your regular day-to-day job, which is awesome. So what tips would you have for people who are 10, 11, 12, 16, who are kind of interested in going down this as a career field?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think basically what you're asking is, the way I interpret your question is, how do you learn how to learn? I think that is a really, really fundamental question. Because I think as an engineer, you're always going to be learning. Like you're never going to say, I learned Python and I'm done learning for the rest of my career. I guarantee in 10 years, there's going to be a brand new language, which none of us have ever heard of, and you're going to have to learn that. So I think the way I interpret your question is, how can you best learn how to learn? And if you can figure that out, you're going to guarantee to have a very successful career. So the way I think about it is just I was actually on a panel discussion last week, and one of the panelists said something really insightful. I thought it was really insightful. And basically, he said, cultivate curiosity. Basically, even in the non-programming context, when you look out into the world at, I don't know, when you're driving with your parents in the car, or you're going outside, or you're using your phone, think about how this application, or how is this thing that I'm seeing out on the street, how is it doing what it's doing? If you can cultivate that curiosity of how things work, I think that will move you to understand like what actually is happening behind the scenes. And if you can cultivate that curiosity and always have that mentality of I want to figure things out, that will suit you well. Not even if you decide not to be a software engineer, whatever you decide, that attitude of trying to figure things out is going to make you successful no matter what.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I'll just mention along the same lines is that you have to be persistent, right? Like it's not like, okay, well, I learned this week and I don't have to revisit it a month from now. Programming especially is one of those things where the more you put in, the more you get out. So if you can dedicate maybe, I don't know, half an hour or an hour every single day, that's way, way better than dedicating 8 hours on one Saturday. So if you can kind of cultivate, again, that mentality of always doing it, and no matter if it's like half an hour, an hour, just whatever time you have, do it regularly. That'll take you a lot further than doing it in short snippets.
Absolutely. Very wise words. Thanks, Rahul.
That's a really good question. I feel like it's hard to say like which one do I like working at better, because I think depending on the dimension that you're talking about, it's different. And what I mean by that is Facebook is a much, much bigger company. I don't know. I think there might be somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 people working there. So it's there's no possible way you could know everyone working at the company because it's way too big. And I think that also leads to some benefits. That if you have a design question, or if you have a question about, okay, like how can I do this really weird infrastructure component? I guarantee you there's going to be an expert at Facebook who's going to be able to help you. And they're going to be way, way better at doing that than me. And so you can learn from really smart people at Facebook. At the same time, if I think back to my Pinterest days, when I joined Pinterest, there was about 400 people. And so 400 is still quite large, right? But I think it felt like when I joined Pinterest, I actually knew everyone, at least on the engineering side. I could go up to any engineer and say, hey, like I know what you're working on. I can learn from you. And that kind of social element was really nice. That's kind of the working environment. And the other dimension is the product. So I don't know if you use Pinterest, but I think Pinterest is a really cool product where you can take images and categorize them, right? And I enjoyed using it, but I don't think I use it as much as Facebook. Facebook and Instagram are products I use every single day. And so I think the idea of working on a product that I use every day, my parents use every day, my whole family, they use Facebook every day. And the idea of working on that was really powerful. And that actually is what led me to leave Pinterest and join Facebook. I think one of the things I got really frustrated about when I started out programming is that I would spend so much time debugging. And the weird thing is that when I would show up to my lecture and the professor would teach, they would never make a mistake. So I got really frustrated. Like, why are they able to do it perfectly? And I spent so much time debugging. But then I realized when I got into my real job, like working at Facebook, you'll find the majority of people, the majority of engineers will spend the majority of their time debugging. So I would say, I don't know if I have an exact number, but probably 80% of my time is debugging code and 20% of my time is writing code. So I think that kind of progression of like, you write code and it almost never works the first time. I screw up so much. So I very often have to like go back, figure out what I did wrong and then fix it. And the majority of my time goes into that debugging process.
Cool. So it looks like we've answered all of the questions. So we're going to wrap up our session here. But thank you again, Rahul, so much for both doing the workshop and answering everybody's questions. Again, we'll send out the recording. We can send out Rahul's contact information to the parents who registered you guys, and you guys can reach out to him with more questions. But with that, we will sort of wrap up here. And if everybody could just thank Rahul for his time this morning. I'm glad everyone was able to attend. I hope everyone has a great rest of their weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.